The word enriched appears on nearly every bag of flour sold in America. It has appeared there for more than 80 years. Most people read it the way they read any label, as reassurance, as certification, as a quiet signal that the product inside is good for them, better than average maybe, nutritionally considered. The word implies addition. It implies that something valuable was put in. What it does not say, what it has never been required to say, is that the nutrients listed on that label were already present in the wheat before the mill touched it. That is the contradiction this story is built around. Not a buried document, not a suppressed study. A word printed in plain sight on a bag in every American kitchen that performs a specific function. It makes the removal invisible. To understand how that word got there, you have to go back further than the 1940s, further than the wartime nutrition boards and the federal food standards and the radio campaigns about protein and iron. You have to go back to 1878, to the kind of flour ledger that survives in county archives across the country. Handwritten records of grain received, flour milled, payment collected, customer names. Consider one from a stone grist mill operating in that year, the year before the industrial transformation of American milling began in earnest. The quantities are modest, the geography is local. The flour described in those pages is a whole product, germ intact, bran intact, the full nutritional range of the wheat kernel preserved by the grinding stone that never generated enough heat to destroy it. Those ledgers represent something that existed in nearly every American county, a network of small local mills, stone ground, regional, perishable, and nutritionally complete. Within 30 years, almost all of it was gone. The accepted version of what happened is clean and sounds reasonable. In the late 19th century, industrial roller milling modernized the flour industry. It made flour cheaper, whiter, and more widely available. It fed a growing nation. Later, when nutritional science matured and identified deficiencies in the American diet, the federal government moved to correct them through an enrichment program. Vitamins and minerals were added back to the flour. Standards were established. Public health was protected. That version is accurate about the sequence of events. It is nearly silent about the mechanism. It does not explain what drove the original decision. It does not ask whose interests the correction was designed to serve. This is where the story stops being what it appears to be. Around 1878 to 1880, the Minneapolis mills, led by Cadwallader Washburn and closely followed by Charles Pillsbury, converted to the new roller process, a technology refined in Hungary and brought to the American Midwest, where the hard red spring wheat of the Great Plains could now be processed at an industrial scale. The rollers ground the grain differently from the stone. They cracked the kernel apart and separated its components. The bran was sifted out. The germ was removed. What remained was a fine white endosperm, starchy, stable, and largely stripped of the oil-bearing germ that gave whole wheat flour its nutritional density. The decision to remove the germ was not driven by nutrition science. There was no health objective being pursued, no theory being tested. The decision was driven by shelf life. Whole wheat flour, because the germ contains natural oils, goes rancid within weeks in warm conditions. You cannot ship it across a continent by rail and have it arrive saleable. Stripped flour with the germ removed lasts for months. It is stable at room temperature. It can be warehoused, transported, sold across great distances without spoiling. Shelf life equaled distance. Distance equaled market. Market equaled consolidation. The logic was that simple and that complete. The whiteness was not purity. It was absence. What was being sold as a modern improvement, cleaner, finer, more refined, was structurally a product from which the most nutritionally important components had been removed to make it portable. The whiteness that consumers came to associate with quality was the direct visual result of the germ's elimination. The colour was the evidence of the loss, but it did not read that way, and the milling industry had strong reasons to ensure it would not. Marketing from the 1880s onward worked a consistent message into the culture. White flour was urban, it was modern, it was civilized. Whole wheat flour was coarse, rural, peasant. There was a class structure embedded in the colour of bread, and the advertising amplified it. Cookbooks celebrated white flour's lightness. Domestic manuals praised its consistency. Department store advertisements positioned it as the flour of the progressive household. By 1900, the association was established so deeply that the original standard, whole grain, had become the thing requiring explanation. This did not happen naturally, it was produced. Meanwhile, in Europe and in the medical literature of the American Northeast, something else was happening. Nutritionists and physicians were documenting a rise in deficiency diseases in populations that had shifted to refined grain diets. Beriberi, caused by thiamine deficiency. Pellagra, driven by the absence of niacin. Iron deficiency anemia, rising steadily in populations whose diet had narrowed around the stripped white loaf. The clinical evidence was becoming difficult to ignore by the late 1890s. Some American physicians raised the alarm directly. Some European researchers published findings that pointed at the stripped flour with considerable specificity. The warnings were received. They were acknowledged in medical correspondence. They were debated in academic journals. They were then set aside for roughly 50 years. The question is not whether the evidence was available. It was available. The question is why it produced no regulatory response for half a century, while the industry it implicated continued to expand without interruption. That question does not have a simple answer. But part of the answer is structural, and it begins with what the federal government was actually organized to do during that period. The United States Department of Agriculture, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, was not a regulatory body in the sense we might assume today. Its formal mandate was market development and agricultural expansion. It was designed to grow the American food economy, not to constrain it. The millers were not adversaries of that project. They were among its principal beneficiaries. There was no federal nutritional standard for flour. There was no labeling requirement. Millers were under no legal obligation to disclose what the rolling process removed, and they did not disclose it. Trade correspondence and industry literature from this period described the new process in terms that left no ambiguity about what the rollers did. The germ, the oil, the dense nutritional core of the kernel, none of it survived the industrial process intact. The millers knew this from the beginning. It was noted in trade journals as a characteristic of the process, not a concern. It was reported as a fact of production, unremarkable, not worth dwelling on. The information existed inside the industry from the very first years of operation. It simply did not move outward. By 1910, a small number of large industrial mills, centered in Minneapolis, and a handful of competing regional operations, had captured the dominant share of American flour production. Regional mills, the stone ground, locally distributed whole grain operations that had served American households for 2 centuries, were collapsing under the economic pressure. The stripped flour was cheaper per pound. The stripped flour had superior shelf life. The stripped flour could move through the national rail network to reach markets a local stone mill could never serve. Competing on those terms was not a business challenge. It was structural elimination. There was one additional piece of the economics that the official version never mentions. The components stripped from the wheat, the bran, the germ, the oils, were not wasted. They were sold. Wheat germ went to pharmaceutical and health product manufacturers. Bran went to animal feed operations. The nutritionally dense material removed from the human food supply was resold into adjacent markets. The kernel was being monetized twice, once as white flour, once as byproduct. The profit architecture required the stripping. The stripping required the consumer to accept a redefined product. And the consumer, shaped by a decade of marketing that equated whiteness with modernity and refinement, had already accepted it. This is where the story stops being about a product and starts being about a system. By the 1920s, the inversion was complete. Whole wheat flour was not the default, it was the alternative. It occupied a smaller market share, a specialty position associated with food reformers and health advocates, the kind of people mainstream culture was already comfortable marginalizing. The original standard had been repositioned as eccentric. The industrially stripped product had become the norm, and the norm had no legal obligation to explain itself. What was happening simultaneously at the national level should have forced a reckoning earlier. During the First World War, draft board medical examinations revealed a striking picture of nutritional deficiency in young American men. The data pointed directly at diet. The diet of the urban industrial working class, built heavily on commercial white bread and refined grain products, was producing men who were underweight, vitamin-depleted and compromised in ways not immediately visible on the surface. Military nutrition researchers documented this carefully. Their findings were filed, their recommendations were considered, A generation passed before any structural response was attempted. Even then, the response that eventually came did not emerge from nutrition science alone. In May 1941, a National Nutrition Conference for Defense was convened in Washington. The purpose was to address the documented evidence of nutritional deficiency in the American population and to develop a federal response. Federal nutrition officials and public health researchers shaped the agenda. The standard that emerged from the broader rule-making process that followed, determining what would go back into American flour, which nutrients, in what amounts, was developed in close negotiation with the Millers National Federation and the national bread companies, among them Continental Baking, the corporation behind Wonder Bread, whose institutional interests in the outcome were direct and substantial. Who decided what goes back into the flour is a more complicated question than the label suggests. The answer begins with that process, with those negotiations, and with interests that had nothing to do with returning the heart of the grain. The word they chose was deliberate. Consider the alternatives that were available and were not chosen. Restoration would have implied that something had been taken. Correction would have named a problem. Compensation would have acknowledged a deficit. Each of those words carries an admission inside it, that the process preceding it had produced a loss. The industry representatives involved in those negotiations understood language the way they understood shelf life, as a variable with commercial consequences. Enrichment implies improvement. It implies that the product coming out is better than what went in. It does not merely neutralize the criticism, it inverts it. The word launders the removal by making the removal disappear from the sentence entirely. This was not accidental. It was the first structural decision of the enrichment program, made before a single milligram of thiamine had been added to a single pound of flour. What was actually restored deserves a precise accounting, because the gap between what was removed and what was returned is where the real story lives. Industrial roller milling stripped the wheat kernel of its germ and most of its bran. In doing so, it eliminated thiamine, riboflavin, niacin, iron, folate, magnesium, zinc, vitamin E, dietary fibre, and dozens of phytochemicals and trace compounds that 1940s nutritional science had not yet fully catalogued, and therefore could not require anyone to replace. The enrichment standard mandated the return of 4 things: thiamine, riboflavin, niacin, and iron. Not at original levels, at levels determined by what could be synthesized affordably, added in powdered form at the mill without disrupting the existing production line, and measured reliably enough to appear on a federal compliance checklist. The germ was not restored, the fiber was not restored, the fat-soluble vitamins were not restored, the mineral complexity of the original kernel was not restored. The enrichment standard was not set by asking what the wheat had originally contained. It was set by asking what the mill could add back without changing anything about the way the mill already worked. The machine did not have to change. That was the outcome the industry needed, and that was the outcome the standard delivered. To understand why the federal government accepted those terms, you have to understand what the government needed from that process. By 1941, the United States was moving toward war mobilization on a scale that would require feeding millions of soldiers and a domestic workforce under sustained industrial pressure. The nutritional deficiency data from the WWI draft was still in institutional memory, and another draft was already underway. The government needed a solution that was fast, scalable, and compatible with the existing food supply infrastructure. Rebuilding the flour industry from the rollers up was not fast. It was not scalable on a wartime timeline. Enrichment, adding powders to the existing stripped product, could be implemented across the national supply within months. The wartime framing did the rest of the work. By 1943, enrichment was mandatory in many states, presented publicly as a patriotic nutrition program, a collective effort to strengthen the American body for the demands ahead. The language of national emergency made the standard feel both urgent and unquestionable. You did not argue with wartime nutrition science while men were dying overseas. You accepted the enriched loaf and were grateful for it. What the wartime framing accomplished beyond the immediate crisis was more durable than the crisis itself. Mandatory enrichment did not simply add nutrients to flour. It codified the industrial flour model as the legal infrastructure of the American food supply. The stripped and corrected product was no longer one option among several. It was the defined standard. And once a standard is written into federal and state law, it is extraordinarily difficult to dislodge, not because the science won't eventually question it, but because the industries organized around it have every incentive to ensure it remains in place. Continental Baking understood this immediately. Wonder Bread's marketing in the years following the 1943 enrichment mandates is one of the more instructive case studies in how regulatory language becomes commercial language. The enrichment label was not presented to the American consumer as partial compensation for an industrial removal. It was presented as evidence of nutritional advancement. Print advertisements from the late 1940s and throughout the 1950s positioned Wonder Bread's enriched white loaf as a children's health product, specifically suited to growing bodies, specifically designed for the nutritional demands of childhood. The imagery was bright, the language was clinical enough to sound authoritative, and the word enriched functioned as a kind of unofficial medical endorsement that no doctor had actually provided. Consumer research from the 1950s, much of it conducted by the bread companies themselves, consistently found that buyers interpreted enriched as meaning the product was nutritionally superior, not merely corrected, not partially restored, but above average. The gap between what the label described and what buyers understood it to describe was not a communication failure. It was the communication succeeding exactly as intended. By 1950, enriched white bread was not simply the dominant product in the American market. It was the default infrastructure of institutional feeding. School lunch programs were built around it. Military mess halls served it as the standard grain component of every meal. Hospital dietary programs used it as the baseline bread for patient nutrition. Federal emergency food aid distributed it as a staple. The enriched white loaf had moved from commercial product to civic infrastructure, and that institutional embedding made it nearly impossible to question without appearing to question the institutions themselves. The regulatory architecture completed the enclosure. The FDA's standard of identity for enriched flour, once codified, defined the dominant commercial product in legal terms that presumed enriched flour as the baseline. Unenriched bread required deviation from that standard, additional justification, additional labeling, a deliberate step outside the regulatory norm. The original whole grain product required additional sourcing effort, additional cost, and occupied a specialty market position in a system whose legal structure had been written around its absence. The regulation that appeared to protect public health had the structural effect of protecting the industrial process that had created the public health problem. Step back and look at the full sequence, because the shape of it matters beyond flour. A natural food product is simplified by an industrial process driven by transport economics and profit logic. The simplification produces nutritional consequences that become clinically visible within a generation. The consequences are documented, flagged, and largely ignored while the industry consolidates. When the consequences become politically unsustainable, a correction is negotiated, not by reversing the industrial process, but by adding a partial synthetic substitute to the simplified product. The correction is framed as scientific progress. It is given a name that implies improvement. It is made mandatory, which gives it the appearance of regulatory force. The mandatory standard is then written into law in a form that protects the industrial process and repositions the original unprocessed product as an expensive alternative. The pattern is then stable. This pattern did not end with flour. Look at what happened to refined sugar, stripped of the mineral content present in raw cane, then sold as a purified modern product, while deficiency consequences accumulated in populations that replaced complex carbohydrates with it. Look at the hydrogenated fat story, a process-driven substitution presented as a modern improvement, the health consequences suppressed in industry-funded research for decades, the regulatory correction arriving long after the structural damage was done. Look at the processed breakfast cereal industry, which by the 1950s was taking whole grains, refining them into nutritionally diminished substrates, coating them with sugar and synthetic vitamins, and marketing the fortified result to children as a complete nutritional breakfast. Look at the infant formula industry, which spent the middle of the 20th century repositioning a complex biological product as inferior to an industrially manufactured substitute, then walked the framing back only after the consequences in the developing world became internationally documented and politically damaging. Each time, the intervention sold as nutritional advancement was also the mechanism that locked industrial control over a basic food category into the regulatory and cultural infrastructure of American life. Each time, the correction was set at the level the industrial process could accommodate, not at the level the original food had provided. Each time, The word chosen for the correction implied improvement rather than compensation. Each time, the original product ended up more expensive, more marginal, and more associated with a kind of conscious consumer effort that most Americans could not afford or were not positioned to make. What was called a nutrition program was also an infrastructure program. The two functions were not in tension. They were the same operation, serving the same interests at the same time. Return now to that 1943 loaf of enriched white bread, government-stamped, presented to the American public as a wartime nutritional advance. Look at it again with the full sequence in view. The government stamp on the wrapper is not a certification of nutritional quality in any complete sense. It is the signature of a negotiated standard, a standard shaped by the federal officials who are supposed to govern the industry, and the industry representatives who needed the governing to cost them nothing. The stamp means that the flour inside meets the minimum threshold that the people who made the flour agreed to meet. It means that 4 things were added back at levels that the production line could accommodate. It does not mean the grain is whole. It does not mean the germ survived. It does not mean the fibre is present. It means the machine ran, and then a second, smaller machine added powders, and the result was stamped and sold as enriched. Industry literature from the early years of roller milling was never ambiguous about what the process did. The germ did not survive the rollers, the oil did not survive. The dense nutritional architecture of the original kernel was dismantled by design, and the people doing the dismantling understood this from the first year they ran the machines. What changed in 1943 was not that the loss was reversed. What changed was that the label learned to stop mentioning it. Look at the bag of enriched flour on a kitchen shelf today. The language on it is not meaningfully different from the language on a bag in 1943. The standard has not been substantially revised. The nutrients mandated for replacement are largely the same, selected through a wartime negotiation process shaped by people whose primary organizational interest was ensuring the roller mill did not have to change. Nutritional science in the decades since has identified dozens of compounds present in whole grain that are absent from enriched white flour and that matter to human health in ways the 1943 standard never attempted to address. The standard has not moved to meet that science. It has remained where the industry needed it to remain. The flour in the bag is not the grain. It is what the system needed the grain to become, and the word on the bag is not a description of what was added. It is the name the system gave to what was taken.